Okay, this is Harold. I'm just going to record um, some material from Chapter 8, International Trade. Now, this is actually useful for a couple of reasons. This course really doesn't focus on international trade in and of itself. It's not a course in international economics, anything like that. But Chapter 8 in the book is a nice opportunity to just lock down some of your understandings of how the supply and demand dynamics in trade are useful to understand lots of other things too. And so I thought it'd be useful to go through this chapter. So I recommend reading it. It's actually not too complex, but it's interesting. And also, international trade is an important aspect of understanding the inequality problem in a globalized world, both for understanding the inequality problem in the United States, but also to understand the inequality problem in many of the countries that we trade in, where global trade has created enormous benefits, but also some of the same challenges that we see in the United States. And so we'll get to that. Okay. So some of it we've already picked up, like what's a comparative advantage and why does it lead to international trade? Let me just move the thing out of the way. What are the sources of comparative advantage? Who gains and who loses from international trade? Pardon my ice cream pop. Why did trade protections like tariffs and import quotas create inefficiencies? And of course, why do governments sometimes engage in trade protections, and international trade agreements at least try to counteract this? There's been sort of plus and minuses, but I think the main thing is it can sharpen your understanding of supply and demand and how public policies interact with the basic model. Okay, so the iPhone is kind of the classic example. It's really, there's no one place in the world where an iPhone is made. The displays come from South Korea. They're assembled in China. Research from the United States, and lots of raw material from all over the world. There's no one place where the iPhone is from. And of course, in many ways, we all benefit from that trade. Although there's some minuses too. One thing that is not talked about too much in the book, but the significant human rights challenges in China that Apple and other countries Apple and other companies are turning a blind eye to in many ways, certainly, capitalism is not a charitable enterprise, and there's pluses and minuses to many of the aspects of the way that we go about manufacturing, distributing the products that we have. So international trade is far more important than it used to be as a percentage of world GDP. You can see that here we have from 1870 global trade. Of course, here's the First World War, and then and you can see it's been steadily rising and at an accelerating pace. Although there's been a little bit of a dip of late, but it's basically half of the world's GDP involves world trade. And if you look at different countries and the percentage of GDP, that's gross domestic product, that's basically the economy. We see that Belgium, Canada, Germany, quite a large fraction of the GDP is involved in import and export. US somewhat smaller. Interesting enough, China is smaller. And obviously it's quite important. Now recall, as we talked about basically in the first lecture, a country has a comparative advantage in producing a good or service if the opportunity cost of producing the good or service is lower for that country than it would be in other countries. What's sometimes called the Ricardian model, named after the economist David Ricardo of international trade, analyzes trade under the assumption that what makes production possibility frontiers straight lines. We sort of look for the different ways that different countries have a comparative advantage. The US has a lot of capital, has a lot of highly skilled labor. Another country might have less capital, might have lower skilled labor, but also lower labor costs and maybe lower land costs and other things in the United States. Well, I'm sounding a little garbled, I'm sorry. So again, this is basically the, kind of like the Tom and Hanks story. Autarky is a situation where a country doesn't trade with other countries. And so, here we have the US and China. Oops. And if you look at this, who has a comparative advantage here? So China is more efficient at making iPhones. The US is more efficient at making trucks. How do we know that? The slope of the production possibility frontier. So if the US is just in autarky, might be at this point, China might be at that point. Okay, so 50 million iPhones, 50,000 trucks, 100,000 iPhones or 100 million iPhones, 25,000 trucks. Yep. So if the United States focuses on producing trucks and China focuses on producing phones, both countries can end up better off. Let's just keep hitting advance. There we go. You can see that we can end up with trade at a point that we couldn't reach in the United States on our own behalf. And similarly, China ends up at a point that they couldn't reach, in autarky either. So trade is helping both countries get outside of their own autarkic production possibility frontier. Now, of course, don't confuse absolute advantage to comparative advantage. Even if the US is more efficient at producing both kinds of goods, doesn't mean we're better off without trade. By the way, this is not true, in many ways, if you compare the US with China. It's cheaper for China to produce phones than it is for the US. So we import phones. Now, wages in general, and we'll get to wage determination in later classes. Wages basically track productivity pretty well, hourly output. And if you look around the world, the U.S. is not. Here's the U.S. right here. There's other countries that have higher wages and are more productive than the United States. Although we're certainly one of the most wealthy countries in the world on a per capita basis. Sources of comparative advantage, climate is one. Differences in factor endowments are another. Canada can produce paper a lot more cheaply than the US just because it's heavily forested. Factor abundance, the supply of a factor of production, something that goes into production relative to other factors. So how many forests does a country have compared to how many machines or people they have? So factor intensity, a measure of the quantity of a factor used. So how much labor is used compared with natural resources or machines. If you're a country with cheap labor, you're going to focus on producing things that are very labor intensive. By the way, you could also export the people, by the way. It is, of course, if you look at the United States long-term care sector, for example, there's many people who are working in those fields who are immigrants who have come from countries with relatively low wages, and people are working, caring for seniors and people with disabilities in the United States, and those immigrants benefit from getting a higher wage, and of course the people that are being cared for benefit by getting the care services provided by those women and men who do that. Okay. There's something called the Heckscher-Ohlin model, which basically says that a country that has an abundant supply of a particular factor of production will tend to have a comparative advantage in goods whose production is intensive in that factor. So, if you're making a good that's really that really requires a lot of wood, Canada's got a big comparative advantage in forest production. If you're producing good that's very labor intensive, a country with a low labor cost might be the place where that is produced. Now, I should say that this is the good story. There's also a bad story about this, which is not emphasized in the book, but which is a real thing, which is that suppose that you have a comparative advantage because you don't enforce environmental laws. You could imagine that a country that is willing to tolerate a huge amount of pollution will produce certain goods that where the manufacturing process, the cheapest manufacturing processes are highly polluting. So there's nothing about this that says it's always going to produce a beautiful outcome. There's always institutional questions that have to be considered that are in the background. Differences in technology. Sometimes a country has developed a particular technology that explains its comparative advantage. The Swiss watch, China, if you think about porcelain, China developed porcelain technologies. I have a technology advantage in bird pictures, and actually our new TA Sonny, it turns out his hobby is bird pictures, and he's got these amazing bird pictures. But you could imagine, Silicon Valley, various places where that are hubs of technology can generate comparative advantage in that way. Now, increasing returns to scale is a sort of important concept. We'll get to that later, but sometimes an industry gets more efficient as it grows. So like computer chips, if you build a factory that can produce 1 billion computer chips, each chip is a lot cheaper than a factory that only produces 1 million computer chips. And when you have a situation like that, you tend to get very concentrated industries. So it turns out, for example, wide-bodied passenger aircraft are really only produced in 2 places in the world. I think, by the way, China will eventually be the 3rd place. Seattle, Washington, and is that Tours, France? However you pronounce that. That's where Airbus is made. So there's increasing returns to scale. So there's a couple of really large aircraft manufacturers that are the efficient producers and that compete against each other. By the way, tremendous involvement of government to try to Airbus is heavily subsidized in Europe, and the American airplane industry is a little bit less directly subsidized, but there's a lot of crossover because military production is often helpful to Boeing and other companies. Hong Kong lost its comparative advantage in garments in an interesting way. Basically, wages went up in Hong Kong, and so as wages went up, Bangladesh became more competitive than Hong Kong. Garment production is very labor intensive. Countries with low wage rates will have a competitive advantage there. You can see, by the way, that fact means that it's not always something to be ecstatic about when you're the most competitive country in certain industries. I'm sure Bangladesh would love to be Hong Kong in terms of its per capita income, and specialize in things that have a comparative advantage in something other than its low labor cost. Now let's look at the supply and demand model and how imports and exports kind of how they play out and the impact on domestic producers and consumers. And I think this is actually important because it just lets us understand what's happening in some of these competitive models in an interesting way. So the domestic demand curve shows how the quantity of a good demanded by domestic consumers depends on the price of that good. And then similarly, the domestic supply curve shows how the quantity of a good supplied by domestic producers depends on the price of that good. But suppose that good is being traded around the world. There's a world price of a good. That's the price at which that good can be bought or sold abroad. And you can imagine if people in another country are willing to pay a lot more for a particular item, that domestic producers will respond to that, and domestic consumers may actually find it harder to get the good. It's probably harder to buy a Mercedes if you're in Germany because they can sell it in the United States for a lot of money. So here's just a standard supply and demand curve in autarky. So, this is phones. Here's a domestic demand curve, domestic supply curve. Like your classic X is going to be a market clearing price right there if it's just a domestic market. Okay, we're all cool with that? There's going to be some consumer surplus. There's going to be some producer surplus. Okay. Now, what happens if you start adding imports to that? So here's the autarky price. Well, suppose there's a world price that's a lot lower than that. Okay. Excuse me, my pop is melting. So now what's happening here? So by the way, before you even do any work, it's pretty obvious who some of the winners and losers are going to be in this, right? Obvious winner, domestic consumers. Why? Because the price is going from here down to here. If you're importing cars and all of a sudden cars are a lot cheaper, domestic consumers are going to benefit and they're going to get a lot more consumer surplus. All the people who were already buying phones before, they don't have to change any behavior. And they're just, this rectangle suddenly is additional consumer surplus that they're all getting. Okay? But now also, all these new consumers come in and they're going to get this additional consumer surplus. Now, how about losers? Who's losing out here? Well, in the original situation, domestic producers were getting this big triangle. What are they getting now? These cheap producers keep selling and they get this producer surplus, which is a lot smaller because the price went down. And all of these producers, these domestic producers, they're not producing anymore at all. So they lose all the producer surplus that they were getting before. So this sort of trapezoid looking thing, that is producer surplus that's completely lost. And it's actually being transferred to consumers. Now, from the society's point of view, there's actually a net win because these producers are very inefficient relative to what the world producers are able to provide. So it's actually good for the society to get these, to buy the phones that are produced cheaply in the world rather than have these expensive producers over here. Remember, the height of the supply curve is basically how much it costs the producer to produce that last unit. So the society is benefiting, but there's a big transfer from producers to consumers in this, and some of the producers disappear. And so if you think about, the job impacts, for example, of global trade, those are all the people that are involved along this stretch. And these people, they're still surviving, but they're making a lot less money. So like the wages of workers in these firms is going to be lower and that sort of thing. So let's think about, it's all written out pretty well in this slide. Domestic quantities supplied with trade, it's just these guys out to here. This range in here is all imports. All this, everything between what the domestic suppliers are able to do and what the domestic demand wants, this is all imports along here. Okay? And of course, the price is now a lot lower. Okay? So when the economy is open to international trade, imports enter the domestic market, domestic price falls, and as the price falls, demand increases, and so on. I think I pretty much said everything on the slide. Right? So what's happening if we just hit the advanced key a bunch of times, it's worth going over this again. This X is actually surplus that's transferred from producers to consumers. This W, that's still there. The consumers still get that. That hasn't changed much. But now the Z is all additional consumer surplus that didn't exist before. Okay. And it's actually, this is total gain to the economy. Sort of this X thing is just a transfer from producers to consumers. But the Z is actually additional surplus that is now available to the society because you can buy a good more cheaply than you could produce it yourself. So there's a bunch of workers here who were essentially misdeployed, or capital, whatever resources were along the supply curve. Those are, it's too expensive to produce phones, say in the United States along this part of the supply curve. Those people should be doing some other jobs, and we just get cheap phones from wherever we're getting them. So Z is really the gain of the society from open trade. Okay? And this is actually a useful diagram to pay attention to. Right? And so if you say, what are the gains from trade? It's really that Z thing. The X thing is really, consumers are benefiting at the expense of producers. Okay? Okay? Now let's think about what happens in the domestic market when you have exports. So now let's sort of flip things around a little bit. So now we're selling trucks, and domestically, there's a supply and demand situation where we end up at this equilibrium. But now let's kind of flip things a little bit and say there's a world price that's actually above what the autarky price is in the US. There's lots of demand for trucks in China and other places. So now what's going to happen? By the way, if you think of this, when countries that have very labor-intensive goods that they're producing, when suddenly they're able to trade on a world market, this also could come up quite a bit. You could imagine if we were talking about Vietnam and we were talking about the price of shoes, we could have a very similar diagram. Okay? So now what's going to happen is, of course, more suppliers are going to be producing now. So, it used to be that suppliers were producing at this point, but now they're going to go all the way out to this point. And so all this, so there's a bunch of new suppliers coming in along here, and they're going to be exporting a lot. Now, how much is the domestic demand going to cover? Well, here's where the domestic demand curve hits that world price. So the consumers here are going to buy, they're going to buy this amount, Q sub D. So they're actually buying fewer trucks because trucks are now more expensive than they were before. And everything along here is actually going to be exported. Now note in this example, the winners and losers are kind of flipped. The domestic producers are clearly gaining. They used to get a producer surplus that was this triangle here. Well, now the producers are getting this big triangle here as their producer surplus. And it's kind of the mirror image of the slide that we had before. This little part of the trapezoid now, this thing, that's actually being transferred from domestic, or that's sort of lost consumer surplus. And it is really being transferred from consumers to producers. And then the rest of the consumer surplus, this triangle in here, that's the producer surplus that's coming because they can sell on the world market. So this chunk of the domestic consumer surplus is totally lost because the price is higher. It's lost here. These consumers stop buying, so they lose. They were getting this little consumer surplus before, they're not getting it now. And all these consumers who keep buying, well, they're now paying a higher price, so they lost They lost this rectangle. Okay? So, so some of the domestic supply is now exported. The domestic price rises from the autarky price to the world price, which affects demand. And there's domestic production that is exported. So let's just see what, if we just draw the same thing that we drew before. So now in this case, Z now is going, is additional surplus available to the society. That's just a gain in total surplus. But the X is lost to consumers. And the Y and the W, the Y and the W are kind of the same as they were before. Okay. Now, producers and consumers are not the only people affected by trade. Trade also affects the owners of factor of production, and the factors of production include labor, land, and capital. So, trade has a big effect on wages. It has an effect on the price of land and capital, and the returns that all three of those factors of production are going to get from production. So, and as I mentioned, the Hesher-Olin model says that countries will tend to export goods that are intensive in the factors that are abundant in that country, and to import goods that are intensive in factors that are scarce in that country. Now, trade increases the demand for factors that are abundant in the country and decreases the demand for factors that are scarce in that country. So the price of abundant factors tends to rise and the price of scarce factors tend to fall. So if you think about what happens in the US, if the US is exporting a lot of human capital intensive goods like high-tech designs, things like that, wages for high-tech workers are going to go up. And if the US is importing a lot of goods that are very intensive in unskilled labor, that could be clothing, could be other things, then you could imagine that the wages of American workers who produce things like clothing are going to go down because they are effectively competing with foreign workers who have lower wages. So trade is going to raise the wages of highly educated American workers and reduce the wages of unskilled workers. And in that sense, trade increases wage inequality. Now, there's one bullet that's not here, which is you might assume from this that trade is going to make poor people worse off. And there's one problem with that. What's the problem with that? Well, the goods that we want to buy may be a lot cheaper. So, suppose that the price of an iPhone on the global market is pretty low. Well, American workers who might produce an iPhone, their wages might take a hit. But American workers who want to buy an iPhone, who work at McDonald's or whatever, they benefit from cheap goods. So it is not necessarily the case that trade makes poor people in the United States worse off, but it does have these distributional effects that can really matter a lot. And so that's just a fact about the way trade works. So now trade protection, ever since, so David Ricardo, great Portuguese economist, explained comparative advantage 400 years ago or something. Since then, economists have advocated free trade. This term free trade is a little bit polemical. One of those things where we've chosen the words that kind of lead to the conclusion that we want, but relatively open trade in which government policy should not attempt to either reduce or to increase the level of exports or imports that occur, I don't like this term, occur naturally, but that in a relatively unregulated market would happen as a result of supply and demand dynamics. Policies that limit imports are known as trade protection. And let's think about the two most common ones, tariffs and import quotas. A tariff is a tax that's levied on imports. It's a sales tax on imported goods. And a tariff has two effects. One is that it just increases domestic production because it makes foreign goods more expensive. It also, of course, reduces domestic consumption of the good because the good is now more expensive. And the good is now being produced in a higher cost way. If you really favor domestic producers who otherwise wouldn't be competitive, with their foreign counterparts, of course, the good's going to become more expensive. So less of the good is consumed, which reduces the gains from trade. So let's just look at this, in a phone context. So here's an example where there's domestic supply and demand. and there's a world price that's way below what domestic producers are able to do. Okay? Now, let's suppose that we put a tariff on, we put a big sales tax on imported phones, and that raises the world price of, essentially it raises the price of a phone that you could buy in the United States from whatever the world price is to the world price plus the tariff. Okay? So what's going to happen? The domestic demand, in the absence of the tariff, it would have been here. With the tariff, it jumps up to here. And you can see that the imports are going to go way down. And this, without the tariff, this is imported phones. With the tariff, this is going to be the imported phones. So the tariff is very effective at reducing the imports. And if we hit advance a couple of times, you could see that that imports have, after the tariff, this is the level of imports. Before the tariff, this was the level of imports. So the domestic phone producers are really happy. But let's think about what's happening to consumer surplus in this. So in the old days, consumer surplus was this whole big triangle, and there was very little producer surplus. This was the domestic producer surplus. It was just this little blob down here. But the total surplus of the society was actually pretty big shape. It was this whole big thing, this little triangle here plus this big triangle here. Now, what happens after the tariff? Well, there's going to be some government revenue from the tariff. This is how many foreign phones are sold. So this little rectangle in here is government revenue from the tariff. There's going to be some money that comes in from the government. Okay. There's going to be now also producer surplus, which is going to be, this is what the domestic production is right at this point here. So this triangle here becomes producer surplus. And now what's the consumer surplus? It's this big triangle here. Okay, so there's a bunch of different aspects of this puzzle where we get producer and consumer surplus and we get government revenue. Just to repeat that, this rectangle here is government revenue from the tariff. The height of it is how much the government gets per phone that's sold, and this distance here is the number of foreign phones that are sold. There's the usual producer surplus for domestic producers, which is this triangle here. And then there's the consumer surplus, which is just, this is where we are on the demand curve. It's just the usual consumer surplus triangle right here. Okay? So what's missing from this beautiful story? Well, what do you think is missing? There's two things that are missing. First of all, these consumers here, they've stopped buying. So all the consumer surplus that they were getting before is gone. Okay, so this is lost. That's very intuitive, but there's a second piece that's a little bit less intuitive. And let me tell you what that is. Let's think about this triangle right here. That used to be part of the consumer surplus triangle, and now it's gone. Where did it go? That's kind of weird. Like, what happens to this triangle? And here's what the issue is. It used to be that all these phones that were produced in this area in here were produced super efficiently on the world's, on the world market. Now, all of these phones are being produced by these producers. And it's actually expensive for them to produce those phones. It takes a lot of social resources for, where did my cursor go? Here we go. It takes a lot of social resources for them to produce phones along this axis. So there's a deadweight loss that comes from the fact that we now are producing these phones in a less efficient way than we could get those phones on the world market before. So remember, the height of the supply curve is how much it's costing our society to produce that good. So we've got two sources of inefficiency here. One is the lost consumer surplus because the good's more expensive. That's kind of the obvious part. But then there's this triangle, which is that we've now pushed ourselves into a domain where we're producing something way less efficiently. So the tariff hurts in two ways the overall efficiency of the US market if we did that for phones. And I would say for most of us, this is completely intuitive. We lost some consumer surplus because people stopped buying. This thing is a lot less intuitive. We are now producing something much less efficiently than we could just buy it from somebody else. And that's a real loss to the economy. It doesn't, that's kind of counterintuitive, but we're overpaying, for these supplies. There's some very scarce workers who need to be involved in producing those phones who are now no longer available for whatever else they were doing, that we could have, that they had they been more efficiently deployed. Okay? So the tariff reduces total surplus. And again, it's really kind of counterintuitive. This B thing is a real loss, and it's because we're less efficient. And you can see as it's broken out in this lecture slide. And it's really counterintuitive, but very real. That we're producing a good that's more expensive than it needs to be, which leads some consumers to stop buying it, and it's also just we're just producing it inefficiently, and that hurts our economy. But producers do gain substantially this trapezoid A. That's a big win for the producers. So if the producers have a lot of political influence, you could see how they might push for that. But clearly, in an overall macro sense, from the point of view of the entire economy, a tariff is a very inefficient thing. And there's a whole variety of reasons why tariffs are often a bad idea, but we nonetheless deploy them quite a bit because of the politics of trade. Okay? Now, an import quota is kind of like the taxi medallion thing. And suppose that we don't put a tariff on, but we just limit the quantity of a good that can be imported. Okay? By the way, the interesting thing about this is that this may be the worst possible thing to do, because you end up at the same point as you would with a tariff, but instead of getting government revenue, it turns out that surplus is actually going to go to foreign producers usually. In fact, an import quota is sometimes a nice, helpful way, for foreign cartels, say in luxury cars, to make a higher profit. So suppose that we have, and I've got to do a better job of giving examples of import quota, but we'll come back to that. So here's steel tariffs. In 2018, President Trump imposed a big tariff on steel imports. Steel prices in the U.S. soared as the tariff went into effect, and the tariffs were removed in 2019. But another thing about the steel tariff was that also affected other American exporters, because steel is an important factor of production and other things that the U.S. makes that we export. So this was these steel tariffs are extremely poor policy, but politically they're attractive. I've got to give you some better slides on an import quota, so we'll come back to that. I'll produce that in a separate way. Now, there are arguments for trade protection. One argument is a national security argument. A country should protect domestic suppliers of critical goods to be self-sufficient. And clearly that's an issue between the United States and China on both sides. And presumably the United States is not going to import fighter planes from China, because we want to be able to produce our own fighter planes and not be dependent on China. And China similarly does not want to be dependent on the United States for advanced semiconductor technology, things like that. There's also a job creation argument. Protection can create additional jobs. Now, there are often jobs that are lost elsewhere in the economy that are less visible, but that's an issue. And then there's what's called the infant industry argument, that new industries may need some period of protection to develop. And now, I must say, economists tend to reject this argument, especially because very often it's the most politically influential industries that gain the most protection. And sometimes those are the industries that have been around a long time and are now very inefficient. Particularly around Europe, you will see this tremendous protection for steel industry, things like that. A lot of the countries in East Asia that are now economic powerhouses did pursue these policies, in a very effective way. So I think that economists can be a little doctrinaire about some of these trade issues. Now, one of the interesting things is international trade agreements that are trying to keep a fairly open trade going. And NAFTA between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, which has actually been superseded by some other agreements, is one very famous one. European Union is the second one. So international trade agreements are certainly, an important part of the mix. The World Trade Organization oversees international trade agreements and rules on disputes between countries. One of the most consequential economic policy decisions in American history was encouraging China's entry into the WTO. And now that China has emerged as an economic superpower that at least rivals the United States and may actually surpass us economically in terms of, global trade position and GDP, that was just a very consequential decision the United States made to encourage China's entry in the WTO, and perhaps we might have, in retrospect, pushed for certain concessions from China before we allowed China's entry, in the current situation, we are that's a topic of tremendous disagreement. New challenges to globalization. So one is when wealthy countries export skill-intensive products like aircraft and import labor-intensive products, you can expect to see the wage gap between more educated and less educated domestic workers widen. That's something that, in principle, we could deal with by having increasing taxes on more educated workers to provide services and economic supports for less educated workers. We haven't done that. Economists like to say, well, the winners could always compensate the losers, except that in practice, we just don't do that very often. And that's a real problem. There's also offshore outsourcing, hiring people in another country to perform various tasks. And of course, the thing that people talk about the most is telephone. If you call Apple to get help with your iPhone, you're often talking to someone in India or another country outside the United States. I must say that there's also just people moving is kind of another aspect of outsourcing. So, one of the things that economists sometimes say is either the jobs move or the people move. And if there's a task that can be done very well by people who earn substantially lower wages than Americans would earn doing that, usually there's some way that makes itself felt in the way that good or service is provided. And, we certainly see, we certainly see that, as I mentioned, in the direct care sector and in other sectors as well. So here's some little practice questions. A tariff results in higher consumer surplus, producer surplus, government revenue. What combination of those things? Well, it's going to lead to what? How many people say A? How many people say B? How many people say C? And how many people say D? If you said B, you were paying attention. Producer surplus goes up because domestic producers now are competing against the foreign competitors that are more expensive, and there's the government revenue from the tariff. Government revenue from the tariff tends to be kind of small, but it's there. Okay. Now, which argument is the strongest in your opinion? This, by the way, there's no obviously right answer. One argument is trade reduces the number of jobs in the United States and should therefore be limited. I think most economists would say this is probably not a good argument, but it's certainly wrong. It's certainly not ridiculous. It's wrong to trade with countries that use child labor. That one is an interesting one because obviously child labor is such an egregious practice that we would not want to be purchasing sweaters that were made by 11-year-olds in a sweatshop. Labor conditions in lower wage countries are going to be a little bit worse than they will be in a very wealthy country. and to some extent, that is the path to economic development in countries. And there is, I think it's sometimes we use the expression child labor as a way of avoiding some of the fundamental trade-offs. If you look at, say, garments that are produced in Indonesia that are produced much more cheaply than the United States, they're not produced by children. They're produced by adults who get lower wages. And there are sometimes very unfair labor practices, but very often it's just, no, the wages are just lower. And it's a factory that is not it's a Spartan place to work, but it's not one that has obvious labor abuses. And there's a significant gray zone there that raises some really difficult values trade-offs. Because there's no question that Indonesia, Vietnam, are benefiting enormously economically by the ability to trade in the global markets. But they do very often people are getting pretty low wages, or there are other things happening that are at least partly problematic. We need to keep some industries for reasons of national security. That certainly can be a real issue, especially if you think about the United States and China, United States and Russia. Presumably, we would not want to have cybersecurity firms located in Russia. And we may want to nurture certain industries as they develop. Many people have said we should be doing that with solar panels right now in the United States, things like that. So these are interesting arguments to think about. So that does it. And I'm going to stop recording now. I would say this is one of my more mediocre lectures, but I think this is a useful thing to pay attention to. And I'll do in class an import quota one, which I should have done better last time. Now, what happens if you have an import quota? This in some ways combines the worst aspects of everything. So suppose that we say that, we have cars, and there's a world price of cars that's well below the equilibrium price if you just had the domestic supply and demand. So what we do is we say, well, you can only import a fixed amount, and it'll be this. It'll be this amount that you can import. So now what's going to happen on this diagram? So again, if we had completely unfettered trade, we would be here at the world price, and consumers would be benefiting a lot. Producers would have taken a hit. What will happen with the quota is there's a price at which the domestic supply plus the imported supply with the quota exactly matches the demand. It'll be right here. And it's basically, there's this, the way that you find this price is you say, okay, here's the amount they're allowed to import 50,000 cars. And you sort of take this flat line segment and you attach it to the domestic supply curve, because the overall supply curve is the domestic supply plus what's imported. You say, where does this thing hit the demand curve? So if I sort of stick this onto the domestic supply curve, I kind of keep moving it up until I hit the demand curve. And at this point, the domestic supply here plus the imported exactly matches the domestic demand. And so what happens relative to if we had free trade? And it's a little hard to show. I'll try to show on the blackboard in class how I just did this, but basically you take this little line segment, you attach it to the supply curve, and you kind of keep moving it up until it reaches some height where the domestic supply plus this flat line segment hits the demand curve. And at this point, supply equals demand. It's a higher price than the world price. So you have this deadweight loss on the consumer side. This is lost consumer surplus. This is inefficiency loss because we've got the domestic suppliers along here are more expensive producers than what we could get from the world price. So there's deadweight loss here that's inefficient production. And then there's this other rectangle in here. And then you say, what's that? And interestingly enough, what that is it's stuff that used to be consumer surplus, but it's now actually producer surplus, and it's going to the foreign companies that are selling, that are making it inside this quota. So this is actually, we are actually helping our foreign car companies to make more money. So, when we had quotas on Japanese cars, that actually increased the profit of Lexus and some of the luxury Japanese car makers, because the price was kept high from the quota, and they got to capture some of that, in the form of higher prices than they otherwise would have been able to get from consumers. So this, by the way, if you had a tariff, this would be the government revenue piece. But the way that it's designed, it's just consumer surplus that goes to the foreign producer. Now, so now the market settles here. So there's a consumer surplus triangle that's this guy here. There's domestic producer surplus, which is now this triangle here. So the import quota definitely helps these, the domestic producers. This little thing here is a piece of consumer surplus that's now domestic producer surplus. So there's definitely some benefit to domestic producers, but also to foreign producers. So it's sort of a funny policy that combines a lot of the worst elements of a tariff, and of unrestricted trade. But we have had import quotas before. The auto industry is the most famous example. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to stop recording.